Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're embarking on a truly expansive historical journey, one that spans centuries and continents. The Portuguese colonial empire in Africa.
Yeah, and it's quite a story.
And just to set the stage for how vast this really is, think about this remarkable fact.
Hmm.
It was simultaneously the first and the last European overseas empire, stretching an incredible time frame, from the mid-15th century, 1415, all the way to, well, pretty much the end of the 20th century, 1999.
That's right. It's crucial to understand we're not looking at some single static thing here.
No.
We're tracing this long, continuous, evolving narrative. It really starts with the conquest of Ceuta back in 1415, and it goes right up to the handover of Macau in 1999.
Wow.
So our mission in this deep dive really is to explore the incredibly complex history of Portuguese colonialism, and we're putting a sharp focus on its African chapters.
Right.
We want to get beyond the simple stories and really uncover the different motivations driving it, how it actually looked on the ground, which changed a lot. And most importantly, the huge lasting impacts it left behind.
It's just such a vast timescale. And what really comes through is how the dynamics of this empire were constantly shifting.
Constantly.
They were really strongly shaped by the specific local circumstances in different parts of Africa, and this is key, by the power dynamics of the African societies themselves.
Absolutely. It wasn't a one-way street.
But even with all that change, certain fundamental pillars seem to stay pretty constant throughout its long history.
Yeah, you see these threads running through centuries.
Things like coercive labor systems, right? Pervasive tax demands, deeply embedded racial discrimination, authoritarian politics,
And underlying it all.
relentless economic exploitation. These weren't just occasional features, were they? They were like the bedrock.
They really were. The foundation upon which Portuguese colonialism was built and somehow sustained for centuries.
So for you listening, our goal today is to kind of distill these key insights, maybe highlight some surprising facts, and help you get a handle on what is, let's face it, a really complex historical story.
Without getting totally bogged down, yeah.
Exactly. Think of this deep dive as a journey. We'll see shifting ambitions, the often brutal realities for people caught up in it, and the constant resistance that challenged and shaped things over hundreds of years.
It's a story of interaction, conflict, and adaptation, really.
Okay, let's unpack this huge history. Where do we start? The genesis, right? The very beginning.
Let's dive into its early expansion, those shifting horizons. We're talking roughly 1415 up to the late 16th century.
And the story really kicks off in North Africa.
It does, specifically with the conquest of Ceuta in 1415. This wasn't just, a random battle. It was a foundational moment for Portugal.
Led by King João Miguel.
King João III and the brand new Avis dynasty. Taking Ceuta gave them a fortified foothold in Morocco. And the reasons behind this bold move, they were layered and really important for this new kingdom finding its feet.
You can almost picture the scene, right? Like this intense geopolitical chess game in Iberia.
Totally.
Portugal was desperate to legitimize its new dynasty, get the Pope's blessing.
Just support.
And it was a strategic play, too, strengthening their independence from Castile, their bigger, often rival neighbor.
Yeah, always looking over their shoulder at Castile.
But it wasn't just politics. There were big economic goals, weren't there? Controlling those vital Atlantic-Mediterranean trade routes.
Oh, absolutely. Access to the trans-Saharan routes, the Middle Eastern networks. That promised immense wealth. That was a huge pull.
And there's this ideological layer, too.
Definitely. Don't underestimate that. It was deeply tied to the centuries-long Iberian tradition of the reconquest.
Reclaiming Iberia from Muslim rule.
Exactly. Plus, there was this genuine widespread anxiety about new waves of Muslim invasions. That fueled the expansionist thinking, gave it a kind of a religious justification.
But it wasn't exactly a walk in the park, taking Ceuta.
Oh, far from it. The costs were astronomical. Yeah, we're talking about loans taken out for the Ceuta venture. They were still being paid off in 1440.
25 years later.
Quarter century later. And back home, in the Portuguese court, there were fierce arguments about pushing further overseas.
It wasn't universally popular then.
Not at all. And a really stark, tragic example of this internal debate and the high cost of expansion is King Duarte's disastrous attack on Tangier in 1437.
Ah, yes. That didn't go well.
It was a terrible military failure, costly in lives, costly financially, and famously it led to Prince Fernando being captured and, sadly, dying in captivity in Fez. A very sobering moment for Portugal.
But despite that huge setback, that moment of, national grief, The expansionist drive didn't just stop there.
No, it picked up again under King Afonso V.
Mm-hmm.
We see this with the capture of Al-Star Sagir in 1458,
Yeah.
and then seizing Asila and Tangier in 1471. These wins eventually gave Portugal control over the southern shore of the Straits of Gibraltar.
A really vital spot.
Hugely strategic maritime choke point. But it wasn't just about fighting. This consolidation phase led to establishing numerous fetorias.
Those fortified trading posts you mentioned.
Exactly. Trading factories, really. And fortresses. They became these essential hubs connecting Portugal to trade routes for things like textiles, horses, wheat.
And they weren't just doing this by force. They were smart about legitimizing their claims internationally, too.
Incredibly savvy. You have treaties like Okasovas in 1479 and the more famous Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494.
Which literally carved up the globe between Portugal and Spain.
Imagine that, just dividing the known world. And then, to really seal the deal, they got papal bulls, official decrees from the Pope.
Like Dum Diversas, Romanus Pontifex.
Attorney Regis, too. These basically granted Portugal divine rights to conquer and settle, a spiritual stamp of approval for their growing empire.
It's amazing how these formal international agreements and papal blessings really boosted the crown's expansion, gave them a powerful legal and religious backing.
It did, although it didn't entirely stop others from trying to muscle in, of course. But this expansion, it wasn't smooth sailing. By 1515, their big plan to conquer Marrakesh completely failed.
Right.
Which led to a period of pulling back, digging in North Africa. Local resistance, especially from the Sadian dynasty, who now had artillery, became much more effective.
Harder to just roll over them.
Much harder. And it wasn't just military pressure from outside.
Internal problems, too.
Yeah, arguments back in Portugal, the sheer economic drain of keeping these distant outposts running, that all played a role in them rethinking things. King Juan III eventually ordered withdrawals from several key ports, Safi, Azamor, others.
Ottoman influence was growing too, wasn't it?
Yes, the powerful Ottoman presence in North Africa just added another layer of difficulty, making it incredibly hard for the Portuguese to hold their positions, let alone push further inland.
So what happens when this grand, almost religious vision hits the wall of military and economic reality?
Well, the ambitious North African chapter effectively slammed shut with King Sebastian's failed crusade in 1578.
Ah, King Sebastian, the dreamer.
He really embodied this resurgence of the reconquest fantasy. Led a massive force, some sources say maybe 15,000 people, including non-combatants, into Morocco.
Yeah.
Driven by this zealous idea of reclaiming lost glory.
But it ended badly.
Horribly. The military disaster at Aksar al-Kabir, Sebastian himself died in the battle. It was just a brutal, definitive end to that dream of North African conquest.
A stark lesson in how their military system hadn't kept pace.
Exactly,
Yeah.
compared to the modernizing Moroccan forces. And the fallout was huge. Portugal fell under Spanish rule shortly after the union of the crowns from 1580 to 1640.
Right.
Which effectively ended any big North African ambitions for Portugal. Many Portuguese forts there, like Ceuta, got absorbed into Spanish imperial stuff, or later given away, like Tangier to England.
So this whole North African experience really shows something crucial about early Portuguese expansion, doesn't it?
It really does. It was rarely straightforward or consistently successful. It was full of improvisation, changing goals, and often very harsh lessons learned.
Okay, so as that North African door kind of creaked shut, or maybe slammed shut,
Like slam shut, yeah.
they looked elsewhere. The focus shifts dramatically to Atlantic Africa.
It does. And what's interesting is that this exploration really started as a consequence of those North African struggles. The setbacks there pushed them to look for other routes, other opportunities further south.
So it wasn't just about discovery for discovery's sake.
Not primarily. It was about increasing their sailing skills, learning from careful observation, gaining practical sea experience. You see this with Madeira, discovered around 1419, the Azores in 1431, vital stepping stones out into the Atlantic.
And incredibly, by 1480, they'd explored the entire African Atlantic coast.
Remarkable achievement. Prince Henrique, the navigator, was a key patron. But his motives weren't purely scientific,
No. What drove him?
Our sources point mainly to religious, geopolitical, and economic drivers. He even had this mythical quest to link up with Prester John.
The legendary Christian king in Africa.
Yeah, hoping for an alliance against Muslim powers. It was a mix of hard-nosed strategy and, well, medieval fantasy.
And these islands they found weren't just stopping points, they became strategically vital.
Hugely important. São Tomé and Príncipe, for instance, quickly became central to developing sugarcane plantations.
Right, using enslaved labor.
Heavily reliant on enslaved labor brought from the Congo and Angola, feeding the European market. Cape Verde was also significant, the site of the first recorded encounter between the Portuguese and Black Africans in this phase.
And all this exploration meant they were gathering vast amounts of new knowledge.
Absolutely. Cartography improved dramatically. Look at the Cantino planisphere from 1502. It's incredibly sophisticated for its time. And beyond maps, their curiosity expanded ethnography, botany, zoology, documenting new peoples, plants, animals.
So these expeditions weren't just mapping, they were resource-finding missions, knowledge-gathering missions.
And under King João II, this commitment to Atlantic exploration really deepened. Figures like Diogo Caum and Bartolomeu Dias were absolutely pivotal.
Diogo Caum, he reached the Congo River.
Yes, reached the River Zaire, as it was known, in 1482. He put up these big stone pillars, pig groins, marking Portuguese claims. And crucially, he made contact with the King of Congo, starting that complex relationship.
And Bartolomeu Dias.
Yeah.
His voyage was the really big one, wasn't it?
Oh, a total game changer. 1487, he did what many thought impossible, rounded the southern tip of Africa.
The Cape of Good Hope.
Reached Mossel Bay in 1488. This proved definitively that the Atlantic and Indian Oceans were connected. It blew open the understanding of world geography, opened up sea routes to Asia that bypassed the old land route.
And this is where it gets really interesting commercially. These voyages enabled actual trade networks along the coast.
Exactly. You get the Fetorias again, like Arguim, way back in 1445, and major forts like Elmina, built in 1482. That was the first permanent European settlement in West Africa.
And this wasn't just random trade. It was about setting up secure zones for Portuguese interests.
Very deliberate. Political, military, economic settlement to get access primarily to enslaved people and gold, highly sought after.
And they found it was better to trade than just raid.
Yeah, the shift from often violent raids initially to more stable, relatively peaceful exchange, that proved much more advantageous long-term for the Portuguese. Exploring inland waterways like the rivers of Guinea also helped them tap into existing trade networks further inland.
And they tried to lock this trade down. Monopolies.
They did. King João II, for example, created formal trade monopolies in areas like modern Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Sierra Leone. Later, sometimes chartered companies took over, but the idea was exclusive access.
But these official structures weren't the whole picture, were they? There were informal networks, too.
Oh, absolutely crucial. You had degradados, exiled criminals, and lançados, outcasts, adventurers. These guys often went native, integrating into local African societies, acting as vital go-betweens.
And Afro-Portuguese communities.
Yes, rapidly emerging Afro-Portuguese descendants and Creole communities, especially somewhere like São Tomé, they became essential cultural and commercial bridges. So it was this really complex, layered system, not just top-down control from Lisbon.
Fascinating. A mix of formal forts and informal fixers.
Exactly. This mosaic pattern of imperial setups, often shaped as much by African initiatives and power dynamics as by any grand plan from Portugal. And we see similar complex stuff unfolding in East Africa later, after Vasco da Gama's voyage. Shows their adaptability.
Okay, let's shift focus now to what really became the long-term heartlands of the early empire in Africa. We're talking Angola, Congo, and Mozambique.
Right. These regions really defined the Portuguese presence and their methods of exploitation for centuries.
So, starting with Angola, or the Ndongo Kingdom as it was then, they used a familiar model there.
Yes, from their experience in Brazil. The Donatary captaincies. Luanda, founded in 1576, wasn't just a town. It was a strategic base.
The springboard.
Exactly, to consolidate political influence, military control, and, crucially, commercial advantage, tapping into those lucrative inland trade routes. Paulo Dias de Nove got a donataria.
Which gave him huge power.
Immense. Political, administrative, military, commercial authority, plus the job of settling the place and defending it.
But asserting this direct control wasn't exactly welcomed.
Not at all. This occupation, often pushed harder by Novaes' successor Francisco de Almeida, led to constant, long-lasting conflicts in the Angolan Wars.
And not just with Africans.
No, there were clashes with local Portuguese settlers, even missionaries who often had their own conflicting interests. It was messy, and their initial big hope, finding mythical silver mines inland that fizzled out.
No silver.
Nope, which led to a major shift in focus.
Towards.
It became crystal clear that the trade in enslaved people was the most vital, most profitable asset they could get from engaging with the Angolas.
Odious commerce.
And it largely came to be dominated by powerful Afro-Portuguese families who had their own complex ways of dealing with communities in the interior. Luanda and Benguela became these major hubs,
Human marketplaces.
linking Africa directly to the plantations in the Americas, especially Brazil, which just couldn't get enough enslaved labor.
And that link to Brazil was absolutely critical, even militarily.
Yes, hugely significant. Look at when the Dutch West India Company took Luanda in 1641. Big blow to Portugal. Lisbon couldn't really respond effectively.
But who got it back?
The powerful slave owner community in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, led by Salvador Correa de Sá y Benavides, they funded and led the expedition.
Wow. Brazil intervening directly in Africa.
It renewed that whole South transatlantic system, kept the momentum going for decades, and really cemented Brazil's economic and political influence over Angola.
And that deep connection persisted.
Oh, yes. Strong commercial ties continued. Cane brandy from Brazil was a common currency for buying enslaved people. Even after Brazil became independent in 1822, breaking up the formal Luso-Brazilian Empire, Angola's trade routes, especially for people, stayed strong.
And this pushed them further inland in Angola over time.
Yeah, from the 18th century, you see growing economic, military, political engagement with the interior. The Kingdom of Luanda is a key example of an African state drawn into these networks.
But it's important to remember, right, that despite all this deep economic involvement, actual Portuguese administrative control over Angola was mostly limited to the coast.
Absolutely. Until the early 20th century, really, their reach inland was pretty limited. They relied heavily on existing local networks, African intermediaries for trade and getting resources, rather than direct state rule.
Okay, so that's Angola. Now, Congo, you said their approach there was quite different.
Markedly different, especially initially. Near the mouth of the Congo River, they focused on building strong, almost diplomatic ties with the King of Congo, the man of Congo.
And conversion played a big role.
Huge. King Ninza and Nkuwu converted to Christianity in 1491, became Jean I. He learned Portuguese, adopted European ways, made Christianity the state religion, hoping for trade and military benefits from Portugal.
And his son became a bishop.
Henrique Kinu Mbemba, yes. Sent to Portugal, educated, became the first African bishop in the Catholic Church. Extraordinary. It really cemented this unique political, military, cultural, religious bond.
And the Padroado system helped Portugal's influence, too.
Definitely. The Pope, granting Portugal ecclesiastical patronage rights, gave the Portuguese crown significant leverage through the church overseas.
But this alliance, it was based on mutual benefit, even if unequal.
Yeah, fueled by shared, though asymmetric, economic gains, especially the slave and ivory trades. But this also caused friction with other local rulers, and definitely with rivals like the Dutch wanting in on the action.
So it wasn't always smooth diplomacy.
No. Despite a big missionary presence, Jesuits, Franciscans, Dominicans, there was occasional military intervention, like the São Tomé governor occupying the Congo capital, San Salvador, in 1568 during local conflicts. Even alliances could turn coercive.
And similar dynamics elsewhere, like with Queen Njinga.
Yes, though often much more confrontational. Relationships with the Nongo and Matamba kingdoms of the Mbundu people, Queen Njinga's story there, is incredible. A saga of resistance against the Portuguese.
Fascinating contrast. Angola, often direct, violent occupation for slaves. Congo, initially more alliance-based, now East Africa. Mozambique, another different story.
Yet another variation. In East Africa, things kicked off after Vasco da Gama's voyage to India in 1497-98 opened that sea route. Over the next century, you get this mix Afro-Portuguese, Afro-Indian, Portuguese merchants slowly penetrating the interior of Mozambique, making contact with groups like the Tongas.
And Mozambique was part of the Estado de India for a long time.
Until 1752, yeah. Administered from Goa.
Yeah.
So the focus was very much on plugging into the existing trade networks of the Western Indian Ocean.
What were the big draws in Mozambique for the Portuguese? What were they after?
Ivory was huge, became critical for the financial survival of the Estado de India in the 18th century. That partly drove settlement in places like Inhambane and Maputo Bay to control that trade.
And the lure of gold.
Always. The mythical gold mines of Monomotapa, that powerful kingdom between the Zambezi and Limpopo, that fueled a lot of exploration, ambition, even military campaigns into the interior.
And the slave trade was big there too, different routes.
Very important. It connected Mozambique not just eastwards to Goa and the Middle East, but from the mid-18th century also to the French Sugar Islands, Reunion, and Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. So multiple trade dynamics pulling in different directions.
And those military expeditions like Barretto's, even if they failed to conquer Monomotapa, they established forts.
Yes, forts in Sina and Tet in the Zambezi Valley became crucial launch pads for expansion, both official and private. And this leads us straight into the Prazos da Coroa system.
Right, the Prazos, this unique feature of Portuguese Mozambique. Explain how that worked.
It's kind of a feudal-like system that evolved. Initially, land taken from Muslim communities was turned into chieftaincies. Over time, it became a legal tool for the crown to grant heritable estates, the prazos, to individuals.
They've got these grants.
Portuguese settlers, Indo-Portuguese, Afro-Portuguese, even some missionaries. The idea was to delegate presence, administration, economic exploitation, even security to these private landholders.
So, a way for the crown to have influence without spending much money or sending many officials. Because their administration was pretty weak, right? Just a few forts, few settlers.
Exactly, but very pragmatic, given their limits. It allowed for some crown influence, but the real power beyond the coast often lay with these prazo holders.
And these could be men or women.
Yes, surprisingly, some powerful women held prazos, like Inés Gracias Cardoso. These prazos were like mini-states. They had political power, demanded tribute, including labor from locals. They were key in farming, mining, and especially the slave trade, acting as middlemen.
And they lasted a long time.
Remarkably, yes, well into the late 19th century. They really symbolize the persistence of that older, decentralized colonial model, the ancient regime, long after the Luso-Brazilian Empire formally ended. Shows how much the official structure relied on these local power brokers. And this long-lasting, decentralized power in Mozambique sets the scene perfectly for the next big phase, the 19th century. A time of huge upheaval, imperial disintegration, but also reinvention, with Africa taking center stage for Portugal.
Right. So if the early empire was often about informal influence and shifting goals, the 19th century forces a massive rethink for Portugal. Brazil's independence in 1822, that wasn't just a blow, it was seismic.
Absolutely existential. Losing Brazil, their biggest, richest colony by far, forced Portugal to completely overhaul its imperial strategy, even its national identity.
And this led to the idea of new Brazils in Africa.
Exactly. That became a constant theme in politics and strategy for decades. This vision was propped up by powerful myths, this idea of a sacred heritage they had to preserve, and Africa as this potential El Dorado that could save the nation economically and spiritually after years of weakness.
So it wasn't just about money, it was tied up with Portugal's sense of self.
Deeply. The economic shock of losing Brazil, plus being dependent on foreign help, like after the Napoleonic Wars, really forced their hand. They had to assert a new purpose. So they proclaimed this historical mission to colonize and civilize Africa, even if they lacked the resources of Britain or France. And this involved two connected processes, didn't it? First, the nationalization of the empire.
Meaning, tighter control from Lisbon.
Yes. Lisbon aggressively taking back control, redefining admin structures, planning economic development centrally, moving away from those older, looser models. Sada Bandeira, a key minister, laid out the plan in 1836.
Okay, what were his main goals with this nationalization?
He wanted real political control, cutting back the autonomy of local African groups and even powerful settlers, stimulating a new colonial economy based on plantations, with investment from Portugal itself. Regulating the slave trade now, this is key, not abolishing it immediately, but trying to keep the labor in Africa for their own projects.
Shifting it from export to internal exploitation.
Precisely. And trying to boost European settlement. You see the numbers creep up in Angola, 1,800 Europeans in 1845 to 3,000 by 1875. Still tiny, but the intent was there. Like the Moçambiques colony planned with Brazilian settlers trying to recreate Brazil in Africa.
And the second process, imperialization of the nation.
That was about mobilizing Portuguese society itself, getting everyone on board with the colonial project, official initiatives, propaganda, education, making empire central to national pride, not just some distant thing. The rise of imperial nationalism was a huge part of this.
But changing this sprawling, messy empire wasn't easy. Lots of obstacles.
Huge obstacles. Those old transatlantic economic networks, especially the slave trade ones, were deeply entrenched and hard to break. There was even genuine fear in Lisbon that Angola might try to break away and join Brazil, given their history.
And this reluctance to really push abolition had consequences.
Big diplomatic ones. Britain, their old ally, was now pushing abolition hard, sending warships to intercept slave ships. It was embarrassing for Portugal. It was only really in the last quarter of the 19th century that they properly embraced abolitionism, and even then,
It was tactical.
often instrumentalized, yeah. Used as part of the project of imperial expansion, a way to justify taking more control, framed as bringing civilization and ending the illicit trade.
It's fascinating how abolition got tangled up with expansion.
It really is. The Anglo-Portuguese Treaty against the slave trade in 1842 actually helped deepen this link. It inadvertently pushed the trade into areas Portugal claimed but didn't actually control, like Ambras, Cabinda, Quelimane, and Hembane.
Creating new problems.
New slave markets popped up, which made it clear to Lisbon. Without real expansion and occupation, they couldn't truly stop the trade. So abolition and expansion became politically linked. We need to occupy this area to abolish slavery there.
Like the 1856 decree for Ambras and Cabinda.
Exactly. Only suppress slavery after military occupation. Or that diplomatic spat with France over enslaved workers on a French ship. Portugal used it to loudly assert its sovereignty and supposed abolitionist credentials.
So the rhetoric changed, but the underlying drive for control and exploitation, framed differently, continued.
Pretty much. Then, after a bit of a lull in the 1860s, the drive for imperial expansion really accelerates again, driven by increasing competition between European powers, political, economic, and even missionary rivalries heating up.
And this African Padroado controversy was a big deal. The church rights.
Hugely sensitive, especially when the Vatican gave the Congo prefecture to a French missionary order in 1865. Portugal saw it as theft, a spoliation of their historical rights, and worried it would undermine their political claims in the region.
Why was controlling the church rights so politically important?
Because getting international recognition for their claims over the interior of Angola and Mozambique was seen as depending partly on the stability of their historical religious jurisdiction. If they couldn't even control the church structure, how could they claim political sovereignty? It all got tied together: missionary activity, geopolitics, competition for the Congo River mouth.
So their coast-to-coast dream map had a religious dimension too.
In a way, yes. They thought preserving the Padroado would bolster their political case, even if they had few actual missionaries there.
And João Andrade Corvo in the 1870s really pushed this strategy.
Yes, he cleverly linked foreign policy, aligning with Britain where possible with imperial strategy, aiming to boost Portugal's presence and get international recognition.
But there were still clashes with Britain. Alama, Lourenço Martel.
Significant disputes, yeah, reflecting the underlying competition. And then the Congo Treaty of 1884, signed with Britain but never ratified. Why not?
Strong opposition in Britain commercial, missionary groups, and political rivals in Portugal scuppered it. And that same year, 1884, the Berlin Conference kicks off.
Right.
The scramble for Africa formalized.
A major turning point. New rules for claiming territory.
How did Portugal fare at Berlin?
Mixed bag. It confirmed their coastal possessions, which was good, but it frustrated their bigger ambitions for the interior because now they had to prove effective occupation.
Which must have been hard for them.
Very hard, given their resources. But ironically, the conference seemed to fuel even more imperial nationalism back home. Colonial euphoria really took off in the late 19th century.
And this is where the famous rose-colored map comes in.
Exactly. Those expeditions by Capello, Ivan, Serpa Pinto charting the interior, they created huge public excitement, and the rose-colored map became the symbol of this grand ambition.
Connecting Angola to Mozambique, a solid block across Africa.
A coast-to-coast Portuguese Africa, that was the dream.
But it clashed directly with British plans.
Big time. Especially in southern Africa, this Zambezi, Shire, Mashonaland, which led to the British ultimatum in 1890. Lord Salisbury basically threatened war if Portugal didn't back down.
A stark power play.
Absolutely. The 1891 agreement settled things, but heavily favored Britain. It was seen as a massive national humiliation in Portugal.
But strangely, that didn't kill the colonial dream.
Quite the opposite. This sense of humiliation actually strengthened the commitment to effective colonization, a feeling of we have to prove ourselves even if their actual settlement efforts lagged way behind others. It was a complex mix: ambition, resentment, economic hopes, all tangled up.
So after all that fervor in the Berlin rules, Portugal actually had to try and impose some real control on the ground. This leads to the pacification campaigns.
Right. The 1890s saw these violent military campaigns aimed at crushing powerful African rulers, like in Gaza and southern Mozambique between 1895 and 97.
And they celebrated these back home.
Oh, yes. Big celebrations. Parading the captured Gaza chief Gungunhana through Lisbon Pure Imperial Theater, designed to boost national pride.
But how effective were these campaigns, really?
Often not very, in terms of lasting control. Their practical aims were about expanding the tax base, promoting Portuguese trade by disrupting African networks, and crucially, proving effective occupation to satisfy the Berlin rules.
So, ticking boxes for international law.
Partly, yes. But despite the military force often relying heavily on African soldiers fighting for them, these campaigns showed how fragile Portuguese authority really was. They didn't fundamentally change the local political or economic landscapes much. Old connections and loyalties often just adapted or persisted.
So with such weak official control and limited resources, how did they manage these vast territories? This leads to the privatization of control, right? Companies taking over.
Exactly. Corporate feudalism is a good term. Since the state administration was so feeble and cash-strapped, Lisbon just delegated huge powers control, administration, tax collection to private chartered companies.
Like in Mozambique.
Prime example, you get the Mozambique Company, the Zambezia Company, the Niassa Company, all set up in the early 1890s. They basically ran huge swaths of territory, even had their own African police forces.
And elsewhere, too.
In Angola, the Moçambiques Company had significant concessions. In Guinea, the big industrial group CUF had a near monopoly. And in São Tomé, the Rosas, the big plantations, were privately owned but had quasi-governmental power over workers. So formal sovereignty rested with Lisbon, but day-to-day power was often in private hands.
And this aggressive push for land and resources obviously met resistance.
Widespread and often violent resistance. The military campaigns were often responses to this resistance, or they provoked it.
Where were some key areas of resistance?
In Angola, big rebellions in Dembos, the Congo region, and a major Portuguese defeat in southern Angola in 1904 against the Quamato and Quahamas.
What were people resisting? Taxes, land grabs?
All of the above. Aggressive expansion for economic gain, new taxes, trying to redirect trade routes, forced labor recruitment, asserting political control where there'd been little before. Groups like the Makua, Ovimbundu, Bakongo, Papel, Muslim communities, even some Prazo chiefs, they fought back hard.
So how did the Portuguese try to counter this? Establishing more formal administration.
That was the idea, emerging in the early 20th century partly because of the resistance. Figures like Paiva Cusero came up with plans. Military expeditions plus police actions to pacify, tax, subjugate.
But resistance continued.
Oh, yes. The Congo region stayed in almost permanent revolt over control of rubber trade and political succession. And the Baru Revolt in Mozambique, 1917-18, was huge pan-ethnic across the Zambezi region, driven by increased Portuguese intervention, more taxes, more forced labor, more land taken.
And lack of education was another grievance.
Yes, especially among emerging African elites who felt shut out.
So alongside military force and companies, how did they formalize control over labor and tax, those core pillars? You called it legalized coercion.
That's essentially what it was. From 1899, they legally enshrined the moral obligation for indigenous natives to work. This stayed on the books until 1962.
1962.
Unbelievably late compared to other empires. And they set up a more systematic hut tax regime taxing households, often payable in labor.
Legalized forced labor and tax. But how well could they enforce it?
Implementation was often arbitrary and patchy. Lack of staff, vast areas. Local communities found ways to evade it, leading to migration, some voluntary, seeking work elsewhere, some forced. Even the agencies meant to supervise recruitment, like the Curadoria, didn't ensure decent standards. Contract labor was often just forced labor in disguise, especially inland.
And this system inevitably led to abuses and international condemnation.
Absolutely. Big scandals erupted. The slave cacao of São Tomé, produced under horrific conditions, caused a huge outcry early in the 20th century.
And the report to the League of Nations.
Yes, U.S. sociologist Edward Ross's 1925 report detailing brutal labor conditions in Angola and Mozambique. It was part of a growing wave of international criticism that really put pressure on Portugal.
And reforms were often just for show.
Frequently, yes. Reforms written down in law, de jure, often happened because of foreign pressure, but didn't lead to real change on the ground, de facto.
This gap between policy and reality seems constant. How did the administration itself evolve? Still centralized from Lisbon.
That was always the policy. Lisbon controls the laws, the politics, the budgets. But in practice, local dynamics often won out because they just didn't have enough trained people on the ground. Plus, political instability back in Portugal meant constant changes. Mozambique had 26 governors between 1890 and 1921.
26. Hard to get anything done. Did the Republic try to change things after 1910?
They did try some decentralization. The 1914 organic laws aimed to involve local authorities more, to help achieve colonial goals, collect taxes, enforce labor, gain influence. A pragmatic move, really.
And the high commissioners later, giving them more power.
Yes, the 1920 guidelines created these powerful high commissioners like Norton de Matos in Angola, Brito Camacho in Mozambique. They had unprecedented autonomy, almost like viceroys.
But the companies still held sway.
Oh, yes. Corporate feudalism continued. The Mozambique Company kept its territory until 1942. And Diamong, the diamond company in Angola, got its huge monopoly concession in 1921, basically running its own state within a state.
So decentralization attempts were partial and maybe led to financial problems.
That's what happened. Giving local governors budget control led to debt, which pushed things back towards centralization again, especially once the military dictatorship took over in Portugal in 1926.
Under João Belo and others.
Yes, strict metropolitan control came back, less investment in the colonies, smaller services, more aggressive taxes.
And then the Estado Novo, Salazar's dictatorship, really cemented this authoritarian colonial model.
Absolutely. The Colonial Act of 1930 was key. It perfected centralization, made the historical mission to colonize a constitutional principle part of the regime's core identity and propaganda.
And legally formalized racial hierarchy.
Yes. The 1933 Organic Charter and Overseas Administrative Reform reinforced centralization, tried to professionalize the colonial service a bit, but crucially, it locked in the distinction between civilizados, citizens, mostly Europeans, and indigenous, the unprivileged African majority.
Institutionalized discrimination.
Unequivocally. The plan was clear. Metropolitan interests first. African communities were to be taxpayers, laborers, raw material producers controlled by local Portuguese officials, chefes de posto, and their African police auxiliaries, cipayos.
And forced crop cultivation.
The Culturas Obrigatorias from 1937, boosting sugar, coffee, cotton production with government quotas and fixed low prices. Yet even with all this central control on paper, they still relied heavily on indirect rule using local chiefs, company concessions to actually get things done.
So new justifications, new structures, but the core exploitation, forced labor, racial hierarchy remained even strengthened. Which brings us to the final phase, post-WWII repressive developmentalism, and the end. That phrase itself sounds like a contradiction.
It really is. And it captures the paradox of the late colonial period. After WWII, you see new changes, institutional, legal, demographic, driven partly by a global modernizing trend, the post-war economic boom, good commodity prices, more mining in Angola, Mozambique.
But Portugal also had to adapt its image, right, with anti-colonial pressure growing globally.
Exactly. They had to reinvent their justifications. Decolonization was happening elsewhere. Political, economic, social change was unavoidable, even for them.
Yeah.
Getting into the UN in 1955, dealing with agencies like the ILO that all had repercussions back in the colonies.
So the overseas provinces label in 1951, just window dressing?
Largely, yes.
Yeah, right.
Replacing colonies with overseas provinces was a semantic trick to deny they were a colonial power, portraying Portugal as one multi-continental nation. Development became the new buzzword. State developmental plans, the Planos do Fomento, started in 1953. Science, social science were brought in to justify continued rule as progress.
And a huge push for European settlement.
Massive. The European population in Angola and Mozambique quadrupled between 1940 and 1960. Reached nearly 100,000 in Mozambique, 170,000 in Angola, and kept climbing into the 70s.
How did they encourage that?
State-sponsored settlement schemes, the coloniados,
Yeah.
giving land, housing, tools to poor Portuguese families to settle, boost the economy, and spread Portugueseness. This massively changed the cities, social structures, and really hardened the racial lines in society.
What about this idea of welfare colonialism? Did they actually invest in African well-being?
Mostly rhetoric, far more words than practice. Any limited improvements in health or education were usually driven by security concerns trying to keep things quiet, not a genuine commitment to upliftment.
And the indigenado system, the legal racial divide, persisted.
Persisted longer than almost anywhere else, only formally abolished in 1961. Until then, colonial rule was legally based on race. Distinctions like primitive, evolving, detribalized natives in the 50s didn't change much in terms of rights.
So despite the talk of a multiracial nation, the reality was still segregation and exploitation.
Starkly different reality. Land expropriation continued, intensified by the new European settlements. Forced labor continued, even after being formally banned in '62, just through different means. Education was minimal, mostly left to the church. Public health was meager, despite some expansion later. The color line was very real, and reform talk didn't erase it. Even Portuguese officials admitted the lack of investment.
So development was really for the settlers and the state, while repression continued, setting the stage for the liberation wars.
Exactly. Repressive developmentalism in action. Development projects merged with military and security needs as challenges grew. Then came the full-blown wars.
Angola from 61, Guinea-Bissau 63, Mozambique 64.
Yes, following earlier massacres like Batepa, Pichigridi, Mueda that showed the underlying tensions. And brutal events continued, like the Wiriamu massacre in '72.
India taking Goa in 61 must have been a shock, too. How did the state respond to the wars? More repression.
Definitely. State intelligence, the PID secret police, expanded massively. Their numbers in Africa skyrocketed. They also used social engineering, forced villagization, resettlement schemes, trying to control populations and isolate the liberation movements.
But paradoxically, the war actually boosted the colonial economies. How?
It's complex. Huge state spending on military and infrastructure, bigger markets due to more settlers, more tax revenue from them, plus foreign investment attracted by resources. It all fueled growth.
So the war economy reinforced the regime's will to fight.
In a way, yes. It gave them a kind of developmental justification for resisting decolonization. Economic modernization became this strange side effect of refusing to negotiate a political end to the wars.
But that couldn't last. The end came from within Portugal.
Exactly. The Carnation Revolution, April 25th, 1974. The military coup, driven by officers fed up with the endless wars, ended the dictatorship. And that led very quickly, often chaotically, to handing over power to the African nationalist movements.
A new era, but shaped by that long colonial history.
Profoundly shaped by it. Independence came rapidly. Guinea-Bissau, 74, and Mozambique, Cape Verde, São Tomé and Príncipe, Angola, all in 75. A pivotal year.
So looking back at this immense history, what's the big picture?
It's clear it wasn't some neat linear process. It was this complex mosaic shifting politics, economics, cultures, constant improvisation, adaptation, often driven by African resistance, a messy interplay of formal state power and informal local realities.
And yet those core pillars remain remarkably consistent across centuries.
Coercive labor, taxes, racial discrimination, economic exploitation, they define the empire despite all the change in justifications and messages.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener.
What does this incredibly long, often brutal, deeply interconnected history tell us about power, resistance, identity? And crucially, how do these deep historical roots continue to shape the challenges and opportunities facing both Portugal and these independent African nations today?
A powerful question. History isn't just in the past, it lives on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Portuguese colonial empire in Africa.